Welcome everybody to Dale's Crying Corner, the show where I record for like 30 minutes and then realize that it wasn't capturing audio for no reason. It hurts. It hurts. Anyway. So, I've already recorded this. I got almost all the way through this chapter, and then I realized that, for some reason, OBS wasn't picking up my microphone. So, we're gonna do this again. Parker's Theorem by Windatyourback. Welcome back, everybody. Parker's Theorem, Windatyourback. This episode, as you can see by the thumbnail, we're finally gonna get to see Toby. The webcam doesn't show colors very well, but in real life, this print is actually really yellow because I was having problems with my printer and the levels, and so it looks like Toby's in severe liver failure. And Tom doesn't look much better. Tom looks like a photo from like the turn of the century that maybe got a really bad attempt to recolor it, but Andrew ended up okay. Look how happy he is. Happy guy. Anyway, so, Parker's Theorem by Windatyourback, Chapter 5, All Beyond Understanding. He was left in fear, but he wasn't alone. We're in Chapter 5, yeah. When Peter Parker was 11 years old, right at the very beginning of his career in middle school, he tried out for the school's co-ed soccer team. It had been a mixture of encouragement from Aunt May, who was eager to encourage Peter to try other things that didn't include deconstructing the house-shared computer or reading Iron Man comic books, and arm-twisting from Uncle Ben, who wanted Peter to stop lounging around the house and so much after school, and to actually try initiate himself in some sports activity. The whole thing was a disaster, of course. Before his powers, Peter was in no shape or form a hidden prodigy for athletics. At the very least, he was skinny, especially for his age, and swift enough to dodge around the more burly kids who were inclined to shove scrawny kids like Peter around than actually play fairly and by the rules. But Peter's natural habit for repeated clumsiness ended up causing a total disgrace on the soccer pitch, and he didn't even make it through the first trial. Peter had never told Aunt May or Uncle Ben, but he wouldn't have stayed on the soccer team even if he did make it through the trials. Whether it was by sheer dumb luck or if he had somehow surfaced some kind of unseen aptitude for sports, Peter would not have joined the team. All because of a distinct memory that continued to linger in his mind to this very day. He recalled sitting in the grass on the edge of the soccer pitch, mud-spattered and sweating under the late summer heat, and silently watching with an expression torn between heartbreak and fury as a group of boys trying out for the midfielder's position were ripping up tiny little earthworms from the soil, fresh from the morning rain, and tearing them in half with malicious interest. That memory alone, of witnessing boys his age rip innocent, hapless little creatures in two just for the sake of spiteful curiosity, had shook him to the core. Perhaps it had been part of the reason why he was inclined to socially outcast himself further from others, or maybe part of the reason why he felt as though he had a responsibility to do moral good to help protect the innocent from ill-natured boys who would grow up to become even more ill-intended men. Perhaps never had there been a character quite as selfless as Peter Parker, who was willing to protect those who needed protecting, and to sacrifice more than he even had to actually give up, even if the people he helped didn't know, if they would never realize, even if they could truly and completely never appreciate the torment and agony Peter would be willing to put himself through, just so those he defended could see another day. It didn't matter who it was. It could be someone close to Peter's heart that always left him with the purification of love and the maddening sensation of grief. Or it could be an enemy he buried the hatchet with, even if he could still feel the heat of revenge burned in his veins on a particularly vengeful night. That, in itself, was something commendable and pitiful. To cast oneself into the fire, even if the flames burned him alive and nobody would know enough to put the blaze out, was an act of the deepest courage and loyalty. A loyalty for preservation of life and of love. It was degrading, really. He could be selfish. He really could just think about himself instead of thinking about everyone else than him. Maybe if he did, his life would be so much more blissful. Maybe everything could have worked out in the end. Maybe Parker's theorem wouldn't even apply to him. What kind of life would he have lived? He would have stalked his uncle's killer, got his justice in some form that he could live satisfyingly with. Or maybe not. Maybe he would never carry the gratification of fulfilling the desire for revenge, and then, perhaps, merely lived on with his powers, considering it an added bonus? Or maybe he would have relished within the fame, and set himself up as a celebrity. Maybe he wouldn't have been so laughably bullied in school. Maybe he would have been able to graduate high school as a normal kid, with Aunt May at his side celebrating each and every one of his life achievements. Maybe he could have gone to MIT with MJ and Ned. Maybe he would have gotten a PhD in biological engineering, or chemical engineering, or something else entirely. Maybe he would have been able to live happily. Maybe. But Peter Parker wasn't selfish. He was the one to lay down on the wire, to commit to the self-sacrifice play, always the first to enter the battlefield and last to leave the fight. The one to lose more than he could stand to lose and be expected to get back up again. He would get back up again and again, struggling, shaking, but he would get back up again. He always got back up again, even on the coldest nights where the radiator adamantly refused to warm up and the loneliness gnawed at him and the temptation to never get back up again was enticing. That temptation was beginning to plague Peter Parker again. The sheer joy of being able to laugh like an adolescent with another version of himself from a completely different universe, his counterpart, his older brother. The delinquent social pariah with a warm grin and a glint of mischief in his warm brown eyes had swept him up and led his thoughts astray from the emotional torment of the last few months. Absorbed in glee, he was able to laugh and smile once more. But those precious moments, that glimpse of a possibility that maybe Parker's theorem was really just the machinations of a hopeless boy, had evaporated. The weight of reality had crushed him. There was always something to throw the wrench into the works, usually provoked by his own accidental or stupid attempts to make things right. As quickly as happiness had come, quicker came the reminding of how fleeting it really was. Now, Peter Parker was dangerous. Utterly and fortuitously dangerous. He was a conductor of energy from the cosmos, as well as a deep and mysterious energy that he knew nothing about, apart from its devastating potential to deconstruct an entire universe. There was nothing in either of their arsenal that could remove this energy from him. No explanation of how he could be radiating such power, and the sense that he was going to be left hopeless once again, as Parker's theorem always dictated. The two Peters took the public bus back to Manhattan, intending on regaining their energy for the journey back to Peter's apartment and their travel to Liberty Island to investigate the Statue of Liberty for further rips in the multiverse's barriers. Peter decided to waive some of his hard-earned tips from his job to outfit Peter 3 with a fresh wardrobe, all whilst politely denying Peter 3's insistence to be paid back. That didn't consist of a Spiderman suit and a spare coat. It was second-hand clothing on sale, a scratched band shirt for a 90s punk rock band Peter hadn't heard of before, and some faded cuffed jeans. But it at least allowed Peter 3 to be able to walk around without gaining attention as the famous web-slinger. The beginning of their trip was filled with theorizing and planning. Olivia might have been carrying something akin to an EMF reader, a device used to measure electromagnetic fields within proximity, but They had no conclusive evidence to determine if any tears in the multiverse even radiated this kind of energy. However, they did know that the rips in the multiverse were emitting high-energy protons, for it was the super collider that worked with these kind of protons that had caused the tears in the first place. The two geniuses could very easily create something to read these protons, and get confirmation if the source of these tears really was centered on the Statue of Liberty, and on themselves. This was the agreed-upon plan. Go to Peter's apartment, construct a proton reader, journey to Liberty Island, and conclude if Olivia Octavius was telling the truth. Perhaps from there they could find the tears and be able to safely send Peter 3 home. The more information they could arm themselves with, the better chances they had at fixing this mess. The steps after that were vague and inconclusive, with further half-hearted discussions of possibly seeking the help of Dr. Stephen Strange, but really all determined on one decision. Make sure the super collider doesn't turn on ever again. The rest of the journey on the public bus was a subdued affair. Peter was stuck in his somber thoughts, trying not to show any acknowledgement at the consistent, concerned glances Peter 3 kept passing to him. The bus circled through the Queens neighborhood and finally took the Queensboro Bridge into Manhattan as the sun started to touch the edge of the horizon, casting deep orange and yellow hues that filtered through the windows of the bus. Gentle movement pulled Peter from his thoughts, and he glanced around. Peter 3 was leaning forward, offering an earbud from some earphones that Peter had evidently stashed into his backpack a long time ago and completely forgotten about. "I thought you didn't have your phone," Peter questioned, fishing the earphone from Peter 3's hand and sticking it in his ear. Where is he? "I don't. Give me yours." Peter relinquished his phone to Peter 3, who started to scroll through Peter's playlists, the tip of his tongue sticking out between his teeth and raising his eyebrows occasionally. Peter's ears grew warm, practically feeling the judgment discharging from Peter 3. "I mean, it could be worse," Peter 3 said slowly. "Some of these aren't half bad. Alt-J, very nice. The Rolling Stones, okay. Imagine Dragons, seriously? Well, at least you're not unironically listening to, like, Coldplay in 2024 or something." Peter's brow furrowed crossly. "I thought you said that you still listen to them." "No, I didn't. I said I'm an extremely cool person who listens to all the popular bands that all the popular kids are listening to, and definitely don't jam out to X and Y when I'm on my own, which we are definitely not going to do now." Now, with the sounds of Coldplay's extremely indie guitar strums playing in his left ear, Peter shifted in his seat and mumbled under his breath. "Are you scared?" Peter 3 shifted a little awkwardly in his seat. "If I wasn't scared, I'd be an idiot. Of course I'm scared. I'm scared for you. I'm scared of what this thing is going to do to us." The corners of his mouth twitched into a small smile. "But it's not going to make me back down. We'll face it. We'll fight. I have you. I have something that's worth fighting for." Tears burned furiously in the corner of his eyes for a moment, and Peter vehemently suppressed them, turning his head slightly to gaze out the window. "I'm just scared that we've hit our limit," Peter murmured quietly, watching the world pass through the window. Like this is going to be too much for us. Maybe this is something that I can't fix." "We'll find a way," Peter 3 replied softly, clasping a hand on top of Peter's worn and red knuckles. "I know we will. We always do. But the dark energy is something that we'll also deal with," Peter 3 finished. "There's no point looking it up, Peter, which I know you're going to do as soon as we get back. It'll only worry you more, right? We're going to find a way to fix it." "Even if that ends up making things worse for me," Peter bitterly thought in his head, but kept those discontented thoughts to himself. New York's traffic was jam-packed, the roads congested with the weekday workers finishing their work for the day. The two Peters hopped off the bus several stops away from Midtown, concluding that it would be much quicker to walk back to Peter's apartment. Neither of them spoke very much, but they were still awkwardly sharing an earphone each and staying in such close proximity within each other that their arms kept touching as they walked. Peter's apartment was chilly from the dying evening cold that was seeping through the thin walls, yet nothing else had altered since they had left earlier in the day. Clothes were still strewn across the rickety floorboards, and Peter's leftover crusts from his breakfast were lying forgotten on a plate on his bed. Peter 3 moved over to the makeshift lab at the kitchen table, already shifting through whatever scraps he could find to begin their work on a high-energy proton detector, or a goober, as Peter affectionately nicknamed it. Spider-Verse reference. As the pair worked, Peter's thoughts strayed, and he began to think about Tony Stark. In a moment like this, Peter sorely missed having a Stark-owned fabricator that would have been able to do all the work for them instead of constructing something using a broken TV remote that sneaked into one of his moving boxes and some makeshift glue from a failed concoction of an extra-thick webbing experiment. But Peter quietly reminded himself of his own makeshift crafting without the usage of such technology. He had, after all, designed extremely tensile webbing and cures for supernatural opponents, all in a school science lab before. Hell, even Tony Stark himself had allegedly been able to forge a prototype arc reactor and the very first Iron Man suit from scraps in an Afghanistan cave. Designing a high-energy proton reader with an equally, if not far superior, intelligent and gifted universal counterpart of himself was, at this point, the metaphorical equivalent of making an exploding volcano from a plastic bottle and some baking soda. Whilst Peter started to focus on some of the more complicated hard wiring, Peter 3 snagged Peter's rather old laptop to research into Octavius Industries. It was not too difficult to find information about at all. It started formerly as a small biotech company focusing on neurologically linked prosthetics to assist the disabled, and was taken into Olivia Octavius's proprietorship, alongside an anonymous co-owner, to further pursue research both within and outside the aforementioned area of science. That's not all. There's a news article even talking about the collider tests, Peter 3 said, spinning around in the chair to face Peter, and having to wiggle his body around when his trajectory was off by a few degrees. They had to get approval from the mayor's office for it, but apparently the mayor was all for it. Her industry got a lot of financial backing. Like, almost a strange amount. All from extremely interested financial sources. They highlighted one backer, Sloan Limited. I don't know if you ever... Peter shrugged, his concentration still poured into wiring their device. Peter 3 leaned closer into the screen, squinting slightly as his eyes scanned the article. It's a shell company, established by a Wilson Fisk? Fisk? Peter piped up, sparing a momentary glance over to Peter 3. Oh, yeah, I've heard his name before. Spent a couple of times at Rikers Island. Big businessman, very rich. Peter's mouth quivered with a momentary gleam of humor. Kinda looks like an oversized blobfish. Hey now, that's mean to the blobfish. Peter smirked again and leaned over to refocus his attention back onto hard wiring, twiddling the little tools into the circuit. Peter 3 leaned back into the chair and hummed absent-mindedly. There's a fly buzzing around my room. A fly distracted me. Peter 3 leaned back into the chair and hummed absent-mindedly, swaying left and right and staring blankly at the laptop screen. The silence stretched on until Peter could feel discomfort crawl over his shoulders. There was still an unspoken tension of the revelation Olivia had presented, something they still hadn't addressed since Peter 3 declared the sheer power that the younger man could be inadvertently discharging. And yet, Peter had absolutely no desire to bring it up again, lest he fall back into a state of panic. Like every other emotion he faced, he would rather stomp on it and bury it away to deal with later. Do you really see me as a brother? Peter asked suddenly, still looking determinedly at the contraption he was working on. A combination of wanting to get it working as quickly as possible, and to awkwardly avoid eye contact with Peter 3 as he approached such a sincere topic. Sorry, I don't mean that in, like, a mean way. It's funny, you know? I know, Peter 3 replied with a small, soft, and almost sad smile. I know. It's weird. Like, realistically, we hardly know each other. We've only hung out for a grand total of, like, a day? But I look at you and it's like we're soulmates. Not the romantic kind, just the platonic and the familial kind. Soulmates exist everywhere. In everyone. Peter paused, touched by his brother's heartfelt remark, and silently nodded. Yeah, I always wanted brothers, Peter 3 continued. You know too well, of course, what it's like to grow up alone. Making friends was never exactly my forte. Ditto, Peter muttered under his breath. So I always imagined what it might be like to have brothers who I could, share a real kinship with. Peter 3 smiled ruefully. Someone I could hang out with, I could prank, I could laugh with, and argue with. Meeting you and the other Peter, it was... He shut the lid of the laptop, glancing upward to think about his choice of wording. Maybe my expectation would have been to see you as just another version of me. Which we are, I know, but seeing everything that's different about us, it's just not possible. I look at the other Peter and I'm in awe of my older brother. He's a guy that I want to be like, right? Someone who seems like the perfect version of Peter Parker. And then I look at you and I'm in full longing to protect my younger brother. That's how it feels. Peter 3 halted his talking, pausing to stare for a second, then looked away. Sorry, I didn't mean to ramble, Peter said, turning around and grinning. Yeah, I do the same thing. But I get you. It's how I feel. I don't see you as me. I just see you as a brother. My older, cool brother. And the other Peter is like the older brother that we both look up to. And maybe the one to keep us in check, Peter 3 snickered. I really shouldn't wish for this, but I am kind of very carefully hoping that he might pop out of a crack in the multiverse and help us sort this shit out. He kind of seems like he has it all together. He managed to actually make it work. Peter wasn't sure how to reply to this, and he had to look back away to hide his bottom jaw quivering. He could only think of Parker's Theorem, and how he was resolute in the idea that Peter Parker, any version of Peter Parker, could never be happy. And how in God's name that Peter too was able to smile and confidently say that he made it work. Luckily, he didn't need to hide the fact that he didn't have a response, because the small circuit board managed to cover him by choosing to spark an electric shock right at that moment. A small flare of light flashed around the whole apartment, immediately followed by a loud snapping sound, and Peter whipped his hand back and wringed it, whilst hissing like a viciously angered cat. Peter 3 yelled back at the piercing crack of electricity, almost tipping the laptop off his lap. Mother trucker, dude! Motherfucker! Peter swore at the same time, baring his teeth at the device. It's always at the end when I'm done! Oh, yeah, I'm done, Peter added, spotting Peter 3's face split into a beam. He raised the device and shook it lightly on display. It was simple and kind of makeshift. Made from a deconstructed broken TV remote with all the buttons pulled out. At the top of the little box were 5 LED lights, ranging a color scheme from green through yellow to red. Not bad for work done in an hour or so, huh? Peter beamed. A battery-powered, high-energy proton measurement tool. I mean, if we had the time, I'd have totally wired in a frequency meter so we could actually tune in between the different intensities of protons, so we could differentiate between us and the cracks. But that would have involved... Oh, his ramblings were interrupted as Peter 3 stood up from his chair and squeezed his younger brother into a warm hug. Peter reciprocated, then inwardly sighed and leaned in closer to truly relish in the embrace. That sad little voice in his mind briefly wondered how much longer he'd be able to enjoy these moments before he was forced back into a life of total solitude and struggle. But once again, he pushed the thoughts away. The only thing that existed, as ever, was the present. He almost didn't want it any other way. Peter 3 squeezed hard suddenly, causing Peter to squeak from the ache of the bone-crushing hug, then pulled away and ruffled young Peter's hair with an earnest grin. You are amazing. You know that? Peter felt his body grow warm, and he looked away, awkwardly rubbing the back of his neck. No, Nah, thanks. I mean... Peter 3 shook his head wildly, gripping Peter on the shoulders and shaking him. You are! You're amazing! You're the coolest! Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. I mean, you're cool too! You're the coolest! You are! Don't give me that look! You're amazing! No, Nah, agree to disagree. I don't disagree, though. I really think you're amazing. Don't keep us off topic, Peter 3 scolded cheekily. Let's go. We'll run a test at Liberty Island. It'll be fun swinging around old territory again. Bounding with excitement that was charged enough to share amongst the two of them, the two Peters hurriedly squeezed back into their Spider-Man costumes. Peter was the first to get changed, putting their handcrafted device into his backpack and swinging it over his shoulder, then leaping forward to open the window. Sliding it half open so as to not cause it to creak and disturb his neighbors, he was halfway through sticking his foot out of the window when a question occurred to him. Peter glanced over to Peter 3, who was throwing the borrowed green coat over his shoulders again, and pulled his Spider-Man mask up over his face. It was going to be a difficult change of pace to the vibe, but Peter needed to know. Peter? Peter 3 asked, picking up his mask from the sofa with his foot and kicking it into the air and into his palm. The youngest Peter grimaced, hesitating for a moment, then spoke. I keep thinking about MJ and how she fell off the statue, and Peter, do you miss Gwen Stacy still? Even after over 10 years? After all this time? Peter 3 faltered. Immediately, a sense of sadness drew into his expression. A deep, mournful sorrow that stretched well beyond his years as a young adult. He remained silent for a moment, allowing himself to envelop in that old grief again, as he would always allow himself to, as though it might atone for what he had done. Or failed to do. Finally, he looked up, grimacing tightly and with tears conjuring in the corner of his eyes, and nodded. Always. Always will. I'm sorry. I really am. Yeah, me too. Peter 3 lifted his mask to pull it over his head, but then faltered once again and pulled it back up again. Wait, Pete. Peter, who was now practically sitting on the windowsill, stopped and looked back. I never told you it had been over 10 years. And I didn't tell you her full name, either. How did you know that? A shocking silence reverberated around the room again, filling the empty space with a now familiar sense of nauseating dread. Both Peters stared directly at each other, sharing in their startling surprise. Peter could feel the sweat on the back of his neck, each individual droplet tracing lines down his skin, and he swallowed a shaky breath back. I dreamt about her last night. I saw Gwen. But I think I saw her in your eyes. I knew everything. She was smiling, Peter. He turned and dropped from the window, clinging to the wall, so he could at least provide Peter 3 a brief moment of privacy that he so clearly needed. The Statue of Liberty was still adorned in scaffolding, even months after the battle there. It was no longer about construction, but instead about repairs. The shield of Captain America had been removed, now following the actual public opinion of electing not to have it constructed. It felt a sacrilege, after all, as though tarnishing Captain America's name. For the time being, visits to the statue had been off limits until next year, meaning they didn't need to worry about being spotted. Both Peters thought their new proton reading device was broken at first, because its levels never went below 4, regardless of where they stood. But upon brief experimentation, they found it was not faulty whatsoever. If they swung far enough away from the island, the levels steadily decreased. Of course, this only meant there was only one logical conclusion. Liberty Island truly was a hotspot for the tears in the multiverse. And yet, they could not find any visible cracks. The pair hopped and bounced around desperately, swinging and leaping around in a vague hope that one of them might vanish and end up into the alternate universe. But their attempts were apparently to no avail. There were only 3 other spots that went above the 4th level on the proton reader. The very peak of the statue upon the raised torch, and radiating directly from Peter and Peter 3 themselves. "It makes sense, though," Peter said as they both sat upon the iron bars of the scaffolding near the top of the statue, swinging their legs and pressed right up against each other for a sense of comfort. The spot on the torch, it was the spot where Doctor Strange cast the spell to make everybody forget me. It was the point where the cracks were closed by Strange, and it was around here where they first split from the box exploding. So these tears, they'd be the weakest here, right? If we think of all the efforts to close them, like the spell, acts as like an adhesive, then that glue is just falling apart now. Peter paused before launching back into his spiel, this time with a rising sense of worry. And then there's me. It just confirms what Dr. Octavius said, right? That I'm the fixed point of it all. I was the reason it split apart the first time, and the reason why it closed. So, I gotta be the reason why it's opened the second time, right? There's no other reason why you, of all people, would be dragged back into my universe. Fear was squirming in his stomach again, and was so obvious on his expression that even Peter 3 could see it. The older brother budged closer to him, casually swinging an arm over to very gently press into the small of Peter's back, and replied, "Well, we're not sure about that last bit. That's all speculation. It wasn't just me being pulled through universes. You were as well." "And others," Peter said abruptly, hitting his fist into his palm. "People have been vanishing in the last few weeks. After a fight, I'd tie them up, and moments later, they were gone. The webs were never broken. It was like they were never there at all. And then other people were just appearing from nowhere, too. Appearing out of nowhere, too. Maybe they were from your universe? But they always turned up confused and aggressive?" Peter 3 finished, nodding sharply. "I'm not kidding. I had the exact same problem. People would just turn up and be weirdly angry and I don't know. I can't think of the best word for it. I want to say sad, but it was an aggressive, inconsolable kind of sad. I have no idea why. I just thought there might be a weird mental health epidemic going on. And then you, Dr. Octavius said you're giving off residual energy or something. That would explain why this reader goes crazy on you too. I hop between universes as well. I guess some of that energy crap rubbed off on me. I don't feel any different." He experimentally flexed his hand, then whipped it forward with his palm outstretched. His expression fleetingly became excited, but then flopped back to his side as nothing happened. "Aw, I didn't even get any cool powers out of it like you have." "Tearing open the multiverse and having creepy clairvoyant-like powers isn't cool," Peter replied, with an air of aggravated bitterness leaking from his tone. "So, what do? We know what Octavia said was right, and she seems to know more than she's letting on. So, maybe..." "If you're about to suggest going to Octavius Industries, drop it," Peter 3 said quickly, with a harsh tone that caught Peter off guard. Have you forgotten what she said to you? She'll kill you. She'll kill us. She'll use you as some kind of concentrated fuel to power her stupid experiment and tear apart the multiverse until both our universes collapse into each other. But she knows things, Peter insisted. She knows. She knows about the energy and the tears, and she knows she caused them, and now she knows that I'm the heart of it all of it. Again! Again! He pulled his hands through his hair, tugging on the strands, and clenched his fists to turn them into bundles of knots. And dark energy! Dark energy! Dark energy! We don't even know anything about that, and she seems to know everything. It's the energy that expands the universe, right? If I'm giving off enough of that to surpass the collider that's been putting tears into the multiverse? Panic struck through him, ringing and reverberating into his very being. He could already feel his heart starting to race and his throat beginning to seize. He couldn't get enough oxygen into his lungs, even despite his fierce and intense attempts to breathe. Peter, come on, breathe, Peter 3 said, fully alert and extending an outstretched hand to attempt to calm him down. Breathe, you're having a panic attack. I'm a fucking time bomb, Peter cried out, jumping to his feet and precariously balancing on the iron bar that made for the fence of the scaffolding. The whole universe could collapse at any fucking second, just because I exist. We have no idea what this power could do. I'm tearing up the whole multiverse just by being here. It would make sense after all. I mean, there's the Big Rip, there's the cosmological model, the ultimate fate of the universe. It could happen. You looked it up, Peter 3 breathed shakily, who had stood up as well. I told you not to look it up! All the stars and the galaxies, atoms and subatomic particles, and even space-time itself. Dark energy could tear it all apart from the sheer acceleration until all the atoms become infinitely distanced. That could happen here! To me, and to you, to New York, to everything, because of my existence! Peter, your hand! Peter glanced down fleetingly. At some point within his total hysteria, he had dug the nails of his ungloved hand so deeply into the skin of his palm that he had drawn blood. Tiny beads of scarlet fluid ran in between his knuckles, but his attention did not linger for more than a fleeting glance. Tiny, inconsequential, just like he had thought for so long. He had believed to be tiny. Parker's theorem was only ever meant to be tiny. And now, he was far beyond that. Despite the burning terror that caused terror to heave on his shoulders and burn his lungs, Peter wheezed and almost alarmingly cackled derisively. I should have listened! I mean, a spell to make me never even exist? It was just a sign, wasn't it? A big, stupid sign hung up on the door, telling me to make it happen, that I should never, ever have even existed. Don't say those things! Peter 3 whispered, his eyes turned glassy from tears swimming within. Hold up, tears? He cries a lot. Hold up. There we go. Peter 3, don't say those things, Peter 3 whispered, as his eyes turned glassy from the tears swimming within. I need you to exist. Nothing in this stupid universe, no matter what kind of god-tier power it thinks it has, gets the fucking right to say that to you. If I had dropped off the roof, we wouldn't be in this situation, Peter yelled back. Thunder rumbled above them. The two Peters' heads whipped upward simultaneously, seeking out the source. Above them, in the cold night sky, not a single dark cloud was in sight. Instead, they could see something else. Cracks of lightning, at a first glance, but they were stationary in the sky. Each splinter seemed to emit an unearthly, trembling light that threatened to pour out from the thin slits it could barely manage to create. The cracks continued to stretch in all directions, like forked lightning splitting through the dark air, and the deep rumbling noises continued to snarl like the low growls of vicious beasts. But now they were intertwined with a new, growing noise, vague and dulled, as though it was coming from somewhere far off. It almost sounded like glass shattering in slow motion, but was strangely ethereal and echoed. They had heard this noise before, barely only a few months ago, upon this very statue itself. The cracks, Peter 3 breathed, his whispers trembling. The cracks to the multiverse are opening again. Oh God, but why? Why now? Why? Why? His sentence stopped midway through, and the pupils in his eyes shrank into tiny bullet points. Realization sundered through him, shaking him to the very core. But surely not. It would make sense, but it couldn't be true. The cracks of reality had only opened for his young Peter Parker before at specific moments, after a fight where energy and adrenaline was running high. In that moment of desperation, only the night previously where Peter's agonizing scream of despair and loneliness had brought himself, Peter 3, right at his doorstep. And now here, at this very moment where Peter was fueled by terror and rage, the multiverse had cracked open because of Peter's energy, because of Peter's anger and his fear and his misery and his adrenaline. Peter Parker's emotions were tearing apart the multiverse. "Peter!" he cried out, and further fear quaked in his heart as he realized the young Peter had vanished without a trace. No, surely the multiverse hadn't taken him. Not now. Peter 3 whipped and pivoted on the spot, frantically scanning around the scaffolding, his heart racing against his ribcage. But his brother was nowhere to be found. Fear swelled inside him, boiling and rising until a breaking point. "Peter!" He tore a scream of fear from the very depths of his being, allowing it to echo around Liberty Island, and even perhaps through the cracks of a shattering multiverse that was threatening to tear open. Left with no other choice, Peter 3 leapt from the statue, free-falling through the biting cold air, and swung. He twisted around, yanking his web and forcing himself to gain air. Peter 3 was still scanning the island with nauseating fear rising in his chest, threatening to swallow his mind and senses blank with concern. Peter had to be here. Surely he had just ran off. He could not have gone. The multiverse could not have taken him. The cracks weren't even opened. He spotted Peter down below, standing on the star-shaped stone platform that encircled the famous landmark. The young boy was squatting on his knees, hands clawing through his hair in deep distress and almost writhing from the lack of oxygen coming into his ferocious, inconsistent gasps for air. Peter 3 caught another web on the scaffolding, swinging and leaping until he safely landed on the ground. The turbulence of the wind had picked up now, causing Peter 3's brown hair to whip from the fierce gales that twisted and coiled, leaking from the cracks still slowly forming around Liberty Island. Tentatively rising, he desperately outstretched a hand towards Peter and carefully began to ease closer and closer towards his younger brother. Every step was cautious, but he pushed through the wind and his nerves, burning with resolve. "Please," Peter 3 begged toward whatever entity might be listening. "Give me one last ounce of courage. I won't run away from things anymore. I promise to do things right. Please, let me do this right. Let me save him. Let me save someone I love this time." "Peter," he breathed, still carefully advancing forward, but a shiver was slowly crawling up his spine. His enhanced senses had already been ringing his ears from the mortifying danger of the situation, but this one was almost as intense as an electric shock. He could see something lurking within sight, hiding on top of Peter. Something dark, something on Peter's back. Something was very, very wrong. Peter Parker, in the midst of his agonizing terror and despair that was drowning out any kind of functions of reason that was left inside of him, was being crippled with a heavy weight. There was something crushing him, aching on his back. But he could not feel the source, only terror, burning and searing and leaving a permanent imprint on his soul. He vaguely heard a voice behind him, a voice of terror, yet desperate to help. Peter remained still for a moment, then slowly turned to face Peter 3. Except he did not see his older brother, his wonderful, caring, doting, funny, amazing older brother. Instead, he saw somebody else, grinning, eyes wide lit with intense and insane malice, the face that haunted his nightmares and every step he had taken since the day he had lost Aunt May. Rising from the depths of horror came a familiar feeling, one born from fire. Rage manifested in his stomach, rising into his chest until his heart encapsulated pure and complete fury. Rising to his feet, Peter turned to face his new enemy and released a scream that almost broke his vocal cords apart. Osborn! Peter III's expression, lifted in deep concern, dropped into one of fear. Peter lurched forward, teeth gritted and glaring at Peter III with a look of utmost hatred. There was something wrong. Peter would never, ever look this way to Peter III. Even in their short time together, he knew the love between them was mutual. He had to be under the influence of something, surely. A spell? A curse? Was somebody causing him to hallucinate? Or was it the maddening tricks of the incomprehensible universe? He ducked as Peter swung a fist, sidestepped at another, and stepped back at a third attempted strike. A sense of fear fluttered in his heart. Peter wasn't pulling any punches. Peter, hey, it's all right, it's okay, it's me, you need to calm down. Peter III called out, trying all he could to keep his trembling voice steady, and ducked and caught Peter's wrist mid-swing. It's me! It's Peter III! It's... Desperation lined every bit of his tone, but Peter seemed either deaf to it or even more enraged. With a roar of anger, the younger Peter jumped up and collided 2 feet squarely into Peter III's chest. The older man was flung backwards a few feet, skidding against the stone ground below and coughing from the impact. Peter! It's just me! It's your brother! Peter III cried out, rolling onto his knees and shakily crawling back onto his feet. It's me! I'm not Osborn! I'm your brother! I'm your brother! Blinded with incoherent rage, Peter swung more punches, which Peter III either dodged or deflected with his forearms and elbows. The wind swirled and twisted around them, and the sounds of cracking glass and thunder humming like a low, war-like drumbeat started to deafen Peter III's sobs. I love you, Peter! Please, Peter! Peter paused, gasping for breath, and his frozen expression of murder remaining. But Peter III recognized the hesitation. From directly behind his brother, Peter III could have sworn he saw a flickering glimpse of something. A shadow, much too large and much too terrifying. Peter? Peter suddenly cried out once again, a mix of rage and agony, and hurled another fist, this strike dark and dangerous, intended to be fatal. Peter III lifted a hand to catch it, knowing that it would be fruitless. This was going to be a hit he would have to take. But a shadowed shape moved in front of his face, catching the younger Peter's wrists with a powerful grip and pushing back against the relentless force. Peter III leapt out of the way, almost stumbling over his feet, and stared aghast at the mysterious figure who came from nowhere. The man who had defended Peter III was holding on firmly to Peter's shaking arms, expression firm with empathy and understanding, silent and yet desperately reaching out to say one thing. Don't. An expression worn before, a situation almost cut right from a scene that had played out right here only months prior. But it couldn't be possible. Peter too? Peter III gasped. But where? How the fuck? Peter too remained silent, still gazing directly into the youngest, with a resolute expression of compassion. Peter's expression remained frozen in place, dark and rageful, but slowly shifted from that fury into an expression of utmost horror. He wrenched his wrists away, turning and stumbling away, then arched his back and dug his fingers through his hair whilst gasping between teeth for air. The fight was leaving him. It's okay, Peter, we're here, Peter too said carefully, reaching a hand out towards the young man, his eyes never leaving Peter's face. Despite the terror and weight of the situation, the eldest Peter Parker still had a small, warm smile on his face. We're all together again. I'm gonna get you out of that darkness, just like I said I would. I can't sound like any of these actors. Alright. I need to go drink some more water. Whoops. If you enjoyed, please consider subscribing. Share it with people. I don't know. That's something that people say, right? They ask you to share their videos. Share it, whatever. I don't even care anymore. Oh. Bye.